Okay, so you've got Talespire, and you would like to bring some custom minis into Talespire. Well, great. Talespire now has Taleweaver, which allows you to do exactly that. But in order to use Taleweaver, well, we need to have a mesh and textures. So if you are not a great content developer and aren't going to sculpt these or make these yourself, you're probably going to download them from the internet. So first thing, please respect the licensing for such assets. If the licensing says that you are not allowed to mass distribute them, please keep the asset only to your game and do not upload it to mod.io. But if the asset is allowed to be shared, then please do upload it to mod.io so other people can also make use of that asset. So with that out of the way, when you download an asset, there is 3 possibilities of how that asset might look. The case 1 is the asset is static and already posed. That means it doesn't have a skeletal structure or an armature, and it's basically frozen in whatever pose it comes in. If that's your case, then you don't really need this video. You can go straight onto my next video, which is preparing your files for Taleweaver, and then you can make the asset in Taleweaver. Now, case 2 is the asset is still static. It does not have a armature, a skeletal structure, and it is in the T-pose. So T-pose is what I'm showing right here. It could also be in an A pose, which is similar to the T pose, except that arms are down on an angle. So in that case, it doesn't have an armature, so it can't easily be posed, but you do not want it in a T pose in your game. So in that case, we can use Mixamo to help pose the asset. It will not work with all assets, but it should work with most assets. Okay, and then the last possibility is case 3. We've downloaded the asset, and the asset is not static. It actually has an armature, and it can be posed. For that case, you can just pose it in your software, 3D software, such as Blender. But if you want to save yourself some time, you can use Mixamo to also pose such assets. So let's have a look on how to do that. Okay, so for this example, I've downloaded a US Marine in a T-pose by Andy Woodhead from Sketchfab. So then what we're going to want to do is in Mixamo, go to the Mixamo.com website. If you don't have an account, create one. It is a Adobe account, but it is absolutely free. On the Adobe website, there are lots of things that you can purchase, but access to Mixamo is free, so just create an account and you will get access to Mixamo. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to click on characters. That will show you a bunch of characters available from Mixamo, but we're going to ignore that, and we are going to use the upload character. Now, I'm going to click on here and select the asset that we are trying to pose. I found that FBX or OBJ files work the best. You can also do a zip file, I think, so that you can have both your OBJ mesh and material and textures, or you can have an FBX with textures already built in. So when we select that, it's going to analyze the mesh and load it, and hopefully you should get, after a moment, the asset showing up in Mixamo. Depending on the speed of your computer, the power of your computer, this may take longer. Also depends on how detailed the asset is. If you have a high poly asset, of course it's going to take longer than a low poly asset. So once the asset loads in, you should see a rendering of your asset. If you don't, then there's something wrong with your asset, and you may need to take it into Blender and fix it up, or possibly use a different asset. I have found that the best assets are those that have a single mesh and a single texture. If you have an asset that doesn't have a single mesh or a single texture, I suggest going to my other video preparing files for Taleweaver, because that will go through the process of making a single mesh and a single texture, and you can use that video to do that and then come back to doing this to pose it. So once we've got that, we can hit next here, and now it's going to ask us to basically position different body parts onto that mesh. There is a symmetry here, so if your character is completely symmetrical, you can just set one of the wrists, elbows, or knees, and it will set the other one. If your asset is not completely symmetrical, you can uncheck this. So I'm going to go with the chin here. You can see that there's in the top right, there's a zoomed version, so you can see where you're placing it. And it is important to make sure that you place these points on the mesh. So especially the groin, make sure that it is on the mesh, not underneath it, because that will cause problems. So I'm going to do a wrist here. It looks like the wrist is symmetrical, so we can keep that. Elbows, around here. And knees. Okay, so here we can see that the legs are not completely symmetrical, so I'm going to just adjust this a little bit. And the groin. Okay. Here you can select the type of skeleton. I just go with the standard, unless you have reason to do otherwise. That's what I would suggest. And then we can next. And again, depending on how powerful your computer is, it may take a few minutes for it to try to rig your character. This process will not work with all characters. It is good at characters that have a very defined legs, arms, body, head. So for example, if you have a character with a cape, especially if the cape is kind of touching the back and touching the legs, it will probably have a difficulty rendering that or rigging that. In addition, even if it does, you'll probably see like really weird stretching of the cape when the character is moving and so on. So try to avoid characters that have that type of stuff. In those cases, what you can do is, if you can remove the cape, you can rig your character without the cape, and then once you've got him posed in your 3D editing software, you can then add that cape in. Similar, if the character is holding some objects, like a sword or a gun, you probably want to remove that in your 3D editing software, do the rigging posing, and then add it back in, because otherwise you're likely to get a gun that's going to be all bent out of shape, or a sword that's all bent out of shape. Okay, so once it's rigged, it's going to show us this kind of preview that kind of shows you the how well the rigging did. So we can see here that the legs seem to be quite fine when he's kind of turning. The arms are good. I'm not seeing any kind of mesh being stretched or anything like that. So looks pretty good. So we'll go on. If it didn't look good, you can go back here and try to set those points slightly differently to see if you can get a better result. But in our case, that's good enough. So it looks like possibly our character may not be positioned correctly in terms of height. We're not going to worry about that because we can always fix that in Blender if it truly is not positioned correctly. We are here for the pose. Now, you may be asking yourself, Mixamo it does have poses in its library, but it's mostly about animation. So why are we using that to pose our character? Well, we can use an animation to generate a pose. Now, yes, Taleweaver does not support animations, boo, but we can still take an animation that we apply to our character and then in our 3D editing software find the specific frame that we like for our pose and use that as our pose. So we can still use animations to generate a pose. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to, now that we've got our character loaded here, I'm going to go to the Animations tab. And this is basically the poses and animations. I'm going to do some searching here so that we don't have to scroll through hundreds of options. And I'm going to go with grenade toss here. So I'm going to intentionally choose a animation, not just a pose, so that I can demonstrate the process for doing that. So I'm going to select this, yeah, this grenade toss will be fine. Okay, so now you can see it's applied my animation over here. A couple of things. There's a bunch of sliders here that you can adjust this animation. So for example, throw distance and things like that. The one that I recommend is select the in place checkbox. What that does is if you have, for example, a walking animation and you do not select in place, the character will actually move to a different position. If you check in place, all the walking will be done on the spot. And this is important because if we're going to be choosing, let's say, one of the frames for our pose halfway through that animation, if we didn't check the in place, that character will have actually moved, and then once we are in our 3D editing software, we have to compensate for that so that the character is not positioned off of its base in Talespire. If we check the in place, we won't have that problem, and then we don't have to worry about it in Blender. Okay, so now that we've got that, we are going to hit our download. We want FBX with skin. Frame reduction, I just keep it at none. Frames per second, we're going to keep it at none, at 30. So hit download. And now, hopefully, if everything has worked out, we're going to be able to load that character in our 3D editing software. I'm going to be using Blender because Blender is commonly used software. It is also free, which is a big plus, but you can use other software if you prefer. Okay. Okay, here we are in Blender. So I'm going to go File, Import FBX, because that's what we saved it as. I'm going to navigate to the file that we saved. Wait for a moment for it to load, and there we are. So now, if I turn on my textures, I can see that it is textured, and if I now play the timeline, we can see that it is animated. Now again, we said that Taleweaver does not support animations, so we're going to have to choose one of these frames to use for our pose. So I'm going to choose something like this. Now, again, in Taleweaver, you probably don't want this pose for your character all the time. That would look a little weird, probably. So this might be more of a pose for a morph. but I'm going to use this because it's very distinct. We can tell that it is actually loaded the correct pose because it's a very distinct pose. Okay, so again, if we were to take this right now into Taleweaver, Taleweaver would recognize the fact that you have an armature, and it would reset the animation to the default pose, and we would not get this particular pose. So the way to get around that, I'm sure there's many ways to do this, but the easiest way that I found is to export to OBJ. Now, why OBJ? Because OBJ doesn't support armatures. So it doesn't support the skeletal structure. So when we export to OBJ, it will take the pose that we are currently at and make the mesh for that, stripping out everything else, which is basically what we want. So I am going to delete here the camera and lights because we don't need that. I'm going to select my scene, and then I am going to say File, Export, OBJ, and then I'm going to select the name, such as US Marine Pose, and export. All the defaults should be good. And now I've saved that. So now I want to double check that that's what is has actually occurred. So I'm going to just new, start a new project, and now I'm going to import my OBJ. Import OBJ, downloads. Okay, so we can see now, we seem to have lost our texture that we should be able to fix, but we can see that now we don't have an animation and we don't have an armature. Our character is stuck in this pose, which is exactly what we want. So we need to though fix up the textures. So if we go over to our textures, we have the texture right here, and I am going to just pick it off again. That was in try. US Marine textures. Yes. Sometimes when you export the OBJ file, it does make a materials file, so we saw that the material did actually show up, but sometimes the mapping to the actual texture file is not quite correct. So either you have to go in and edit the MTL file, or you can pick it off in Blender just like I did. And that's basically it. Now we have a character here that we got as a T-pose, but we have used a Mixamo animation to pose our character. We then selected a specific frame to use, and now it is ready for pulling into Taleweaver and making an asset out of this. Now, if we have a character with a armature, the process is exactly the same. We wouldn't have to do that rigging in the first place, but we would just then upload our character directly into Mixamo, apply our animation, bring it into Blender, and then exactly the same way we pick off one of the poses in that animation, save it as an OBJ, then load that OBJ, and we get the exact same thing. So the only difference is if your character starts off in a static T-pose, we first need to do that rigging to add the skeletal structure, the armature. But if you already have an asset that is rigged then you can skip that step and you can go straight to applying a Mixamo pose. And that's about it.